Working at the threshold is the foundation for every technique that follows in the section called the Xtremes. Anytime we're dealing with articulation, that is the definition of a note, we'll be working right at the threshold. The threshold being the point in space over the volume loop at which you are right at the edge of silence and noise. When you first get your theremin, the factory settings have already been made and your threshold, that distance, has been set. Depending upon the manufacturer and the factory settings, that distance varies from machine to machine. So let's take a closer look at where the threshold usually is. So now, using your theremin, let's try to locate the threshold, the precise point at which noise becomes silence. The way to do it, the easiest way to do it, is to put your hand in the control space and slowly work your way down to silence. And note the distance. Search around the loop. It can change slightly. The question is whether that distance is going to work for you. Many of the techniques that we're going to use in the Xtremes involve more than the lifting motion of your hand. And many times, in sweeping motions and some of the other things that we're going to explore, if the threshold is too close to your volume loop, you can end up hitting the antenna quite a lot, particularly in rapid passages when you're doing a lot of fast notes, and if you have to get very, very clean staccato in somewhat regular succession. You can also find yourself hitting that volume loop if the threshold is too close above the loop. You can choose right now to leave your theremin as it is and work with the threshold just as it stands. But I'd like to offer you the possibility of making an adjustment to your theremin that could raise the distance of the threshold a little bit higher off the loop and give you more room to play. That being said, there are a number of modifications that are out there that are available, such as one for the Etherwave Pro that is apparently a modification that allows for even a much smoother type of approach off the loop, a really, really subtle range of crescendo. If that modification has been made, it's going to be difficult to get clean articulation and that sort of snappy articulation off of your volume loop. That being said, let's take a look at what you can do with your particular machine to raise that level. One proviso, and that is, once you make a different adjustment, you are at risk for never being able to get your original setting back again. There are a couple of safety precautions and ways that you can mark things, but it does involve, on an Etherwave and on a B3 Deluxe, opening your machine up and making an adjustment. Let's take a look at each one, and it'll be up to you to decide whether you do it or not. Here is the Moog Etherwave Pro, and the trim pot for controlling that threshold over the volume loop is right here. Can you see the little hole? We're going to need to get much closer and a much brighter light to see what's inside there. As we look inside with a flashlight, take a look and just about orient it in the center of that trim pot. Can you see it? There's a small brass fitting. It's a little difficult to light. Let's see if we can, there it is. And in it is a standard screwdriver slot. But it's so small, you're going to need a very small screwdriver. Something along the lines of this. And this screwdriver can fit carefully inside and get into the slot of that little tiny screw. that you can see in the center of that hole. There it is. So, by putting that screw in, and in general, turning it slightly, and I mean very slightly, you can reorient that threshold. Unfortunately, there's really no way other than drawing the position of that screwdriver slot in the hole to reorient yourself. This is a very, very tiny adjustment. Do it very gradually if you decide to do it. Very small adjustments until you can raise that threshold about 2.5 to 3 inches over the volume loop. This is a B3 Deluxe theremin. On the standard B3, I don't actually have one here, but the orientation of the volume loop is pretty much the same relative to the volume control and the pitch control. On the standard B3, if you turn it to the underside, there's actually a trim pot, access to a trim pot in a little hole right near the volume loop. And it is that hole that you put a small screwdriver in, and you use it to get a good distance off of the volume loop. As we said, the standard distance usually is about 1/2 inch or a little bit less, and according to Dan Burns, who makes these, you can probably raise that threshold possibly another 1/2 inch to about 1 inch above the volume loop by accessing the trim pot. Now, with the actual B3 Deluxe, the only way to get to the trim pot is to take the bottom apart. With the B3 Deluxe, you have 6 screws that need to be taken off from the underside. When you set it down, obviously you have to do this upside down, so when you set it down, be sure to protect the pitch rod by moving it off the edge of your table and letting it hang over. So, the next thing you need is a screwdriver. But this screwdriver needs to have a certain type of bit. As you've seen, the slots for the screws here are square. You're going to need to find a square bit. I believe the size is called a number 1, but you can go to any hardware store and get a bit. Many times the bits are sold separately. They're about $1. And you can, if you have a magnetic screwdriver shaft like this, you just slide it in, it sits, and then you can begin undoing the screws. Let's get all 6 taken out. Alright, I have just one more to remove. I want to remind you that when you're removing these screws for the very first time, be sure to press down fairly hard and turn slowly at first, because they appear to have been slightly heat sealed or adhesive sealed just a little bit, and you'll hear a little bit of a snap when you take the screw out for the first time. Now, let's open it up. In order to get the bottom off, you have to be very careful. It's a very tight fit, and you'll notice that the join between the bottom and the sides is really, really thin. So I suggest using a very small flathead screwdriver, tiny, and just carefully work it under the edge. It takes a lot of patience, and it may feel as if it's not going to give, but eventually you'll be able to slip your thumbnail or fingernail under and lift, and don't be surprised if it makes a little bit of a snapping noise to get the bottom off completely. Just go nice and slowly all the way across the body of the theremin, and just be very careful of your edges. Move very slowly, and eventually it will come off. we're ready to make the adjustment. So that you can see the orientation of it, I have the theremin facing away from me as opposed to toward me as if I would play it. The control knobs, the volume knob is away from me. As I move it to the left, you can see the volume loop coming off the side of the machine. What we're looking for is to follow this wire back, and here is a trim pot. This will control the response off of the volume loop. Again, you're going to need a very small screwdriver, one that can fit inside the slot. However, before you make any adjustments, the actual position of the slots on the trim pot. As you can see, there's this little X configuration right in here. I'm going to use the one that is going from the top right down to the bottom left. And what I'm going to do is take a Sharpie, a little red marker, and literally draw right in the slot to mark which one it is. Then I'm going to do just as I did before. You'll notice there's a raised edge on the outside of the trim pot, and I'm going to put two red marks that come directly off the ends of the screw slot. That way, I always know that it is this crosshair in the X that must face back on this diagonal in order to get back to its original position. But in order to make the actual adjustment, we need to hook the theremin up, turn it back over, and make the adjustment using a screwdriver from the underside. With the bottom still removed from the B3 Deluxe, we're going to make the adjustment. Before we do, let's look at where the threshold is now. It's literally a quarter of an inch, a little over a centimeter, a little under a centimeter above that loop. Let's see if we can get it to maybe an inch above the loop. Now, in order to do it, I would suggest you use a flashlight and your small screwdriver. Once I've gone underneath and positioned the screwdriver, we'll continue. Alright, this gets a little tricky. I have to hold the screwdriver with my right hand, and I'm going to be using my head to test that threshold. What I'm going to do is turn. We still have it at the factory setting. I'm going to turn that screw slightly, very slightly, clockwise. And look, the response, this was a very, very small adjustment. And the adjustment has been made. The threshold, that's about as far as I dare go. But it's now about an inch to an inch and a quarter above the volume loop. I have to stress very, very small clockwise turn of the screw. And you've got your adjustment. Now you have just a little bit more room to work at the threshold. This is the Moog Standard Etherwave theremin. I've unattached the 4 Phillips head screws and lifted the cover off. And I've oriented the theremin just as it would be if I were playing it. You can see the control knobs here and the beginning of the volume loop off to the left. In order to change the response and increase the distance above the antenna of that threshold, we're going to be dealing exclusively with this trim pot right here. In your manual that came with the Etherwave, on the component layout of the Etherwave circuit board, it's pictured here. It's called L11. In order to make the necessary adjustments to that trim pot, I suggest you use two things. First is absolutely necessary. It's the small tool that came with your Etherwave, and you'll be using the end that has the hexagonal shape to it, because inside this trim pot is a small hole that is hexagonally shaped, and the little tool fits right down inside. It'll also help you to have a flashlight so that you can really see down inside. Let's look even closer. It's a good idea to get a piece of paper and make a drawing of the exact position of that hexagonal hole, because your tool fits right down inside of it like this. And once you start turning it, the orientation changes. So let's look at how you would do that on a piece of paper. From my vantage point, if I am looking directly down into the center of that trim pot, this is the orientation. The hexagon is slightly tilted to the left. What I'd like to do is make sure I can stay oriented this way for my original position. The top is here. So what I'm going to do is use these 2 points on the hexagon as my point of reference. Here and here. The way you do that on the actual theremin is like this. I'm going to do my best to orient that trim pot using a very fine marker. You can see the interior of it now. You can see the hexagon. I'm going to mark on the outside, the metal part of the trim pot, the position of those 2 edges right where they actually fall. Here and here. Let's see if I can make that. There it is. That's more visible for you. Just to be safe, I'm going to reach down into the trim pot and at this point make a mark literally at the edge of that hole, just a dot, and another one on the left side. Now that's going to be much more difficult for you to see, but when you do it yourself you'll be able to see it. But they are there. So I've oriented the 2 corners of the hexagon inside the trim pot and aligned them with the 2 marks I made on the outside surface of the trim pot. This enables me to turn it back as closely as possible to the original position. Factory settings on the Moog generally place the threshold about a ½ an inch to 3/4 of an inch above the volume loop. Take a look. There it is. It's very close to that loop. I'll start from here and you'll see. Look at when it gets silent. When it's totally silent, it's just about a ½ an inch above. That, for my personal taste, is too close, because when I'm doing runs of rapid notes or I'm doing very, very strong attacks in sequences of certain notes, the tendency is for my hand to hit that volume loop. And that can be true of any of them, the Pro, the B3 series, anything. So I like to set that threshold slightly above. In order to do it, you use the little hexagonal pointed tool, stick it inside the trim pot, get it to fit nicely, and turn the trim pot slightly clockwise while you're testing where the threshold is. And as you turn it slightly, that point between noise and silence is going to be higher up. As I said, I like mine to be about 3 inches above the volume loop.